Hey friends, welcome back to Bible Fun with the Duns. Today we read Deuteronomy chapter 17, and in this chapter God tells them, through Moses, he tells them more of what life is going to look like when they go into the promised land, how they're supposed to follow the rules, who they're supposed to obey, when the people who are chosen to be judges over them are in charge. They're still God's people, and they're supposed to carry forth God's judgment. So what they say is final. This is something that we talked about, when they choose to have a king, what that should look like. And so even when we follow through and read later in the Old Testament about the kings that come up and all the different kings that come, they are supposed to follow these laws. And so my takeaway today comes from just what we were just talking about. We were saying every single one of these laws that God is giving these people, he already knows they're all going to be broken. And so that we were talking about that because my takeaway is not only does God go before us, and I know I say that like every other video, but it's huge to me. That's so important to me as a natural worrier, as a fearful person, as a controlling person who wants control. I know I'm to submit to God. I know I'm to trust him and not be the one worrying, instead giving it to God. And because God has the character that he has, because he is who he is proven to be trustworthy over and over again. So he goes before us, but more than that, our dog is excited. More than that, he makes provision for us even in our sin. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. There's nothing more beautiful in a God who created us knowing that we would turn against him, knowing that we would turn to idols, knowing that we would choose sin over and over and over again. And yet he still continues to make a way and provide for us. He goes before us and he makes provision for us.
Yeah. I like how when you read through this chapter, like the information is not just on one little thing. So you can't read this chapter and go, oh, it's only about the food laws. Because the information here is pretty broad. For instance, look at it in verse number 4, where it's talking about idolatry. And it says, and it is told of you, and you hear of it, then you shall inquire of it diligently. So somebody was known to be worshiping idols in the land. The people had to deal with it. So idolatry was the constant temptation of the Jewish people, so they had to be alert about its dangers. And they also had to have the courage to kind of root it out whenever they saw it. And what you're seeing whenever you look in verse number 4 is that people, even if they were wrong, they could not be convicted on hearsay. It had to be documented and had to be right. And in verse number 10, though, when their path became clear, they were supposed to take that path obediently and efficiently in regards to being holy. Like once you found out there was a problem, you went after it. Jesus is going to talk about this too when he talks about the believer's life. He says, if your right eye offends you, it's better to pluck it out. If your right hand offends you, it's better to cut it off. And he's saying you go to the root of the problem and you deal with it. Now, what's interesting there when he's talking about court, the sanctuary court here in Israel, their decisions were supposed to be binding. So God was not going to allow his people to ignore his commands or flaunt their sin. Israel was supposed to be a place of law and order and devotion to him. But the most interesting piece for me comes down in verses 14 through verse number 20, where it's talking about the kings. The Lord made provision for the day when Israel would eventually want a king. The problem with this was, as we'll see later with Saul, is that the problem would be in them in having the right king in the right way at the right time. And ultimately, the right king for Israel could not come from within Israel completely. The right king had to come from heaven, because only the heaven-born king, the heaven-sent king, only he could fully keep the law. Jesus. Only he could be the prophet, the priest, and the king all tied up into one and fit this mold. What's interesting is, like when Solomon is a prime example of this. So like look in verse number 17 where it says, he shall neither multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. He's not supposed to go back to Egypt. Well, where did he get his first wife? Egypt. He's not supposed to multiply horses. Well, he had like 1,000 stables full of horses. Shouldn't accumulate silver and gold. Well, it's the one thing he had, man. He had wives and he had silver and gold. And so he's breaking all of these laws, which means that just because somebody like Solomon has wisdom, and listen, he did. He had wisdom. Just because somebody has wisdom doesn't mean they always use it. And like look in verse number 19, it says, and it shall be with him, this is talking about God's word, it shall be with him and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God and be careful to observe all the words of the law and the statutes. So God's law, God's word was supposed to be his constant guide and foundation every day, that he might be the king over Israel, but there is a king over him. And that's important. Now, look at verse number 20. That his heart may not be lifted above his brethren. I'm going to tell you, God's word and God's way humbles the heart when we read it honestly. But it also sanctifies the ego. Every one of us are born with a sense of ego. We want it our way. We like it in our time. We like everything the way we like it. The problem is, nobody in this world is ever really king. There's only one king, and it's not us. And so God's word refines that out of us. By the way, surrender to God keeps us from getting prideful and even abusing the influence and the authority we have over others in our lives. So you take these kings, when they were to come about, and by the way, it's a train wreck of a situation. Even in Israel's highest points, you got David, who's an adulterer and a murderer, Solomon, who is a serial husband. Yeah, he had a lot of women. And so he's breaking all of these laws. That's the high point of Israelite royalty, which means that we're waiting for a king who is better than all of these kings. We need a better king. That better king has to come from heaven. This is where it pushes us to Jesus. And just notice, whenever you're looking at this whole chapter, it's talking about the legal code, it's talking about the royal code, it's talking about the moral code, don't worship idols. All of these things are things that Jesus comes as the perfect sinless one, that's the moral, the absolute sinless Son of God, that's even legal. And he's the king, that's the royal. Jesus is the answer for all of this. When you're reading through Deuteronomy, you're supposed to be seeing, man, we can't do this on our own. We need a Messiah. All right, so keep reading all this. We'll see you tomorrow in Deuteronomy chapter number 18. Bye.
Bye.